Good morning. Thanks for coming out. So I've got a ton of content here and only an hour to do it in, so I'm going to just dive straight in. My name is Neil Peterson. I work with Microsoft. I work in our content development team. So I've spent most of my time for the last year and a half writing documentation for Windows containers. However, I've been working with Azure pretty much since day one and would say that I'm an Azure enthusiast and a PowerShell enthusiast. So the title of this session is Automating Azure IaaS with PowerShell Beyond the Azure PowerShell Module. Honestly, that IaaS part doesn't matter. I mean, PowerShell applies to Azure well beyond virtual machines. Most of my demos are VM related, although I've got some that aren't. And what I mean when I say beyond the PowerShell module, and kind of the reason I put this session together, and I've been doing this session, I've done this session a couple times over the last couple years, and it is absolutely my favorite session to do. And one of the reasons is because, you know, you've got this PowerShell module for Azure, but there are a bunch of other opportunities to use PowerShell within Azure besides just, you know, using the PowerShell module. So really, we're going to look at four things today. The Azure PowerShell module, we'll spend very little time on that because obviously we want to go beyond that. The second two things we're going to look at are something called VM extensions. Is anybody familiar with VM extensions? So that is awesome. I only got a couple hands here. And I'm really excited about this. And when I've done this in the past, it's kind of been like, okay, that's amazing. We can do some amazing stuff with that. So we're going to look at something called the Azure VM Custom Script Extension and the Azure VM DSC Extension. And then finally, we're going to look at something called Azure Automation. Is anybody familiar with Azure Automation? Couple more hands. So cool. So again, PowerShell module, and then beyond that, we'll look at three different things. So I'm going to blaze through this. In fact, I'm going to blaze through a lot of my slides. In fact, we may not look at a whole bunch, rather just talk through some of this in demos. But just kind of an all-up view of the Azure PowerShell module. Current version is at version 3.0. It was just recently released. Replaces 9.8. But actually, it replaced a whole bunch of other versions. But the reason I left 9.8 in there is that if you've been using the PowerShell module for a while, there was a very big change in how the PowerShell module functioned between 9.8 and the next version. If you're not aware, in Azure, we've kind of got two different operating modes. Azure Service Management, and then Azure Resource Manager. It's basically two different control planes, two different portals, and the way we're moving is towards Resource Manager. The easiest way to think about it is Azure version 2. In 9.8, we actually had a switch, it was switch Azure mode commandlet in the PowerShell module that switched between the two. Post 9.8, we actually have two different modules, one for Azure version 1 and one for Azure version 0.2. All I'm going to be focusing on is Resource Manager in this session. That said, what is Azure Resource Manager? If you came to my session yesterday, we talked about this quite a bit. Big changes between ASM and ARM is that we organize Azure assets into what's called resource group. It's basically, the easiest way to think of it is a logical container of related resources. This gives us the ability to do like unified management on a set of resources, ACL a set of resources, delete a set of resources, as opposed to having just individual resources kind of hanging off of each other. There's some other stuff in here that's not really applicable to this session. If you came to my session yesterday, we talked about JSON templates. We'll see one of those in this session, Visual Studio integration, etc. That said, I'm just going to jump straight into a demo on the Azure PowerShell module. And it's going to be pretty brief because I want to get into the script extensions and Azure Automation, kind of the cool stuff. So with the Azure module, if you need to install it, you can just do find module, Azure RM. So again, there's two different modules, Azure and Azure RM. And then install module. I already have it installed on this machine, so I don't need to reinstall it. And in order to work with Azure from PowerShell, we need to authenticate with Azure. So I can't just, run git VM and return a list of VMs from Azure. That's pretty easy to do. We can just hit log log in Azure RM account, and if I just hit enter there, it'll actually come up and prompt me. And there we go. As well, we don't always have to be prompted. I mean, this is PowerShell. We want things to be automated. There are ways we can store credentials in a PS credential object and automate this process as well, and we'll see that in a little bit. Let me just retype that. And so that should come back and give me confirmation that I've been authenticated against Azure. And now I can start running commands against Azure. And there are a ton of them. I'm not going to dig in and look at most of them. In fact, we'll really just look at one or two. So let's say I wanted to get VMs in Azure. Get Azure RM VM. Now, one of the things is, because we have two Azure modules, the Azure module for ASM, it would be get VM. The same command in the ARM module is get Azure RM VM, or get Azure RM VM, yep. So you can see it returned a bunch of stuff there. Let's say I wanted to trim this down. Select name. Bam, so I can see a list of VMs in my environment. And if I wanted to perhaps power off a VM, I'm not sure what's going on. Let me just try that again. Now, let me just do this for the sake of time. I won't actually authenticate. But yeah, so if I wanted to power off a VM, get Azure RM VM, the name of the VM, the resource group that it's in, and I could pipe that to a stop Azure RM VM command. I'm not actually going to do this. I need this VM. Hopefully I just didn't accidentally power it off. But we'll actually look at this later on when we talk about Azure automation. We'll take this kind of same concept, and I'll show you how you can host these scripts in Azure, allowing you to do things like put a schedule on them, like maybe you want to power off a bunch of VMs at the end of the day and power them on in the morning, and things like that. Let's take a look at something a little more interesting. I'll actually deploy a VM to Azure. So as I said, you can store your credentials in a PS credential object. So I'm going to go ahead and enter some credentials here. And then I can log in Azure. You see it won't prompt me here. Again, when we look at Azure automation, I'll show you slick ways to securely store credentials so that you can kick off jobs in Azure without having to provide credentials at all. I'm just going to put the name of the VM into a variable, so I'm going to name it Ignite Posh. And so as I said earlier, one of the things we need to do is we store related Azure resources in what's called a resource group. I'm going to go ahead and create that resource group, and I'm just going to give it the same name, Ignite Posh. So if I go ahead and do that, and actually if we come into the Azure portal, go over to resource groups, you'll see I now have a resource group named Ignite Posh. However, it's empty. So now I'm going to go ahead and deploy a VM. Let me go ahead and kick this off, and then I'll explain the command because it's going to take a while to run. In fact, we will come back to it. So I triggered this, and you can see it's asking me for some input. I'm going to go ahead and enter some details here, and then I'll explain what I'm doing. All right, so username, password, and a DNS name. Okay, so the command I ran was new Azure RM resource group deployment. I gave it a name. I gave it a resource group name. What I'm really interested in here is I gave it this template URI. So I have this parameter template URI. So what's going on here? What exactly did I do? Well, if you attended my session yesterday, we talked in depth about Azure Resource Manager templates. And basically what I've done is used this PowerShell command to deploy an existing template that I have stored in GitHub. And if you'll notice here, some of the parameters in this template are the values that I was asked for. So admin username, admin password, DNS name. So the command basically, grabbed my JSON, understands, okay, I've got some parameters here that need values. I'm going to, prompt for those parameters. And there's ways we can provide those to the script. I mean, this is PowerShell. We can do all this in an uninteractive mode. And then if we come back over here, we should see this thing starting to populate. So my resource group is now populating. And what I'm deploying here is a Linux VM with Docker installed, and it's going to preload a Docker image. So we can come back in about 5 minutes, and we'll actually have a website hosted on the internet. So there's a bunch of other things you can do. I had a demo that I was going to do if I had time, deploying SQL Server. I mean, there's like I said, there's hundreds of commands in the PowerShell module. It's PowerShell, it's automation, it's pretty cool stuff. That said, we want to go beyond the PowerShell module. So let's dig into some of the cool stuff. I'm going to skip over this VM agent slide and talk about VM extensions. So Azure VM extensions, what exactly are they? Why are they so cool? Why am I so excited to talk about them? What Azure VM extensions are, they're basically small programs that you can run against virtual machines. When we deploy VMs in Azure, something called a VM agent is installed on those VMs by default. You can disable that, but generally the VM agent is there, and it's kind of like the Hyper-V agent or ESX agent. It's a piece of code running inside of your virtual machine. This VM agent coordinates with the back end of Azure, and one of the pieces of functionality of the VM agent is to handle the execution of VM extensions. The two VM extensions I'm going to show you today is the custom script extension and the DSC extension. However, there are quite a few of them. In fact, I've got a slide here. It's a little old at this point, but it shows some of them. We've got BG info extension. So when you deploy a VM in Azure and you've got kind of like the IP address and the computer name on the desktop, that's actually a VM extension that's executed at deployment time. ASICS extension, Chef, Diagnostic, Puppet. And there's a bunch of the antivirus, logging. So these extensions perform configuration of a virtual machine. Specifically, the VM custom script extension executes PowerShell scripts against a virtual machine. Okay. Cool, but we can execute PowerShell scripts against computers. I mean, it's just a computer in the cloud. I can use PowerShell remoting to run a script against the VM if I want to. So what's the big deal about the custom script extension? What's different about custom script extension versus just running a script against that virtual machine is that the VM agent, you store the script somewhere. It can be in GitHub. It can be in Azure Blob Storage. You store the script somewhere, you engage the custom script extension, which we'll do. The VM agent downloads, it copies that script into the VM and executes it locally. So I don't have to worry about connectivity. I don't have to worry about, do I have the right ports open? Am I secure? I don't have to worry about reaching from my desktop to that VM to do anything. It all happens kind of within Azure. So that's cool thing number one. Cool thing number two is that we can engage a custom script extension against an existing VM, which we'll do. But I can also integrate the custom script extension into my Azure Resource Manager templates. And this is one of the things that really allows not only deploying Azure infrastructure from a template, but then configuring those VMs after the fact. So using custom script extensions, I can build full deployments that might do something like, well, in fact, the VM that we just deployed has some extensions built into it. So I'm not only deploying a VM, but once that VM is deployed, it's then going to be configured with Docker, and the right images are going to be pulled down. So you can build a template that deploys the VMs and runs the PowerShell scripts kind of attached to that deployment process. So it really is kind of gives you that 1-2 punch. Deploy the infrastructure, configure the VMs. And that's what the custom script extension does. As we'll see, the DSC extension is very similar, and we'll talk about that. Similar, but incredibly different. So we'll talk about that once we get to it. There's a couple caveats. When we engage a custom script extension, we can only run one script, so we can specify one script. You can chain them together, though. I mean, this is PowerShell. You have a lot of flexibility. You can run one script from the other if you want to. And I'm just going to jump into a demo. I think this works a lot better in action. All right, so let's actually kind of look at some of the coolness. So I have a VM in Azure right here. I'm logged into it. I've just got a simple script here. Let me execute this, and then I'll talk about what I'm doing. And this is just kind of reinforcing what I said about the first cool thing about these custom script extensions. So I'm actually using PowerShell remoting here. Invoke command, computer name. I have the IP address of my VM in Azure. And I'm just running a very basic script to write a log file. So we just wrote that file. Nothing to do with custom script extensions, but what this is requiring is a connection between this laptop and that VM in Azure. And so in order to achieve that, one of the things that I had to do is if we come into this VM, and we have a resource on a VM called a network security group, which is basically similar to a firewall, I had to create a rule to allow inbound connections on 5985. I don't want that. So I'm actually going to delete this rule. And this takes a little bit to go through. I actually may not get to the point where I can actually have this fail, but what will happen is if I now retry to run this script, I'm going to fail. I've basically blocked connectivity. I don't have the connectivity I need to be successful with this. And it's still cooking. Yeah, this example is. Yeah, I mean, this is just this. I wouldn't do this. This is just a simple example of showing the benefit of the custom script extension. And we'll give it one more shot here. And eventually it will fail. Looks like we might, nope, still going. One more shot, come on. And there we go. So it's trying, but it's not succeeding in this. Okay, well dang. So what can we do? Let's look at the custom script extension. So let me go ahead and authenticate with Azure real quick. Get that out of the way. so I have a bunch of variables that I'm going to set up here. One of them being the location of a script in GitHub. Let's go ahead and look at this script. It is actually the exact same script that I was running using PowerShell remoting. I removed the remoting stuff, so there's no invoke command there. I don't have the address of the Azure VM. It's just the log file pieces of it. And in fact, while I'm here, go ahead and clean up a couple things. And I'm just going to delete this folder just for effect. Oh, so there's the PowerShell remoting session that we tried. I accidentally closed the wrong PowerShell session. So let me just open this back up. And re-authenticate. So I won't go through all these variables. I'm going to go ahead and authenticate with Azure. And then the command I'm going to run is set Azure RM VM custom script extension, the resource group where the VM is, and then the URI to the script, the command to be run, or the script to be run, so create file.ps1, and then a location. And while that's running, let me show you a couple things here. So if we go look at my VM, and you can also add script extensions via the console if you want. I haven't really run into a situation where I've wanted to. Actually, I talked to a gentleman yesterday who had inadvertently modified the firewall on his Windows VM such that he couldn't get into it anymore in Azure. One of the solutions you could do there if you wanted to fix that would be to use the custom script extension to trigger a script on the VM to remodify that firewall. But on the properties of the VM, we've got this extensions pane here. If I click on that, you can see that this wasn't there before. The custom script extension has been attached to the VM and it's running now. So we'll actually take a look at that. So it's still running here. Let's actually go look at the VM. And then we'll look at kind of troubleshooting and a couple other things there. So we can see the temp folder was just created. And again, firewall's been closed. I've got no connectivity to this. This is all happening via Azure. I ran the set custom script extension command. I gave it the location of the script. The Azure VM agent went out, copied the script down so we can actually see that. So if I go into the packages folder, plugins, Microsoft Compute custom script extension, 1.8, downloads, 0, bam. So my script is local to the VM, so everything is happening isolated within this VM. If we come out to the root, I can see that, yeah, my log was created. And then one last thing, when doing this, when building complex configurations, I'll often find and to be very clear, I don't generally run custom script extensions against existing VMs. It was just sensitive to our time constraint here. Usually I build these into a template. And oftentimes I'll find my template deploys successfully, but my software won't be there or my configuration won't be complete. So I need to troubleshoot that. Under the Windows Azure folder, logs, plugins, Microsoft.compute.custom script extension 1.8, we've got some logs in here. And the actual output, so whatever has been put onto the output data stream in PowerShell will be written to one of these logs. Now this was successful, there's nothing to see there, But if I did have a failure in my script execution, I could come in here and see that failure almost identically as if I had just run the script myself from a PowerShell session. So last thing I want to do here is show you an example of a template. Don't have time to run one. So I come in here, .NET Core samples, Windows. So templates, deploy all the infrastructure to a resource group. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom here, we can see I've got a resource in here of type extension. And some of the same things we just saw in that single command execution. So I have the URI to the script, the command to execute. So in this case, when I deploy this template, it deploys the VMs, it deploys a load balancer, availability sets, SQL. It then runs a PowerShell script against each VM in that deployment to install .NET Core, configure the firewall, download an application, configure IaaS, configure the whole thing for me, such that when I deploy that template, I go to lunch, I come back, I have a fully functioning and running app. And that is custom script extensions. Let's see how I'm doing on time. All right on track. So let's talk about the VM DSC extension. Very similar to the custom script extension. In fact, the results are the exact same thing. We want to configure a VM. Has anybody in the room used PowerShell desired state configuration? Couple hands. Okay, so I'll take a moment and kind of talk about what DSC is. And I'm by no means a DSC expert. Let's actually just do that right now. So what PowerShell desired state configuration is it was released, I think, in PowerShell 4.0. And instead of writing scripts to configure a system, we can declaratively state how we want that system to be configured using something called a DSC resource, which is similar to a PowerShell module. So don't worry about the screenshot. We'll take a look at an actual script. But so, for instance, like if I was using a PowerShell script to install IaaS, I would run something like install Windows feature, I'm just kind of mumbling it off the top of my head, install Windows feature IaaS. However, if IaaS already exists, if it's already been installed, my command's going to fail. And like if I'm doing things like configuring websites, if I'm writing my PowerShell script using best practices, I'm going to do things like before I create a file, check if the file exists. And if something fails, I want to respond to that failure. So, when we're writing scripts, it's not just about, hey, install this feature, create this file. There's a lot of other stuff that we need to build in our scripts. Error handling, checking to make sure that we're ready to go in a good state. Well, what desired state configuration does is it takes care of a lot of that for us. So, for instance, in desired state configuration, if we want to install IaaS, it would just be a chunk of code that says feature IaaS ensure, installed ensure. Just basically make sure IaaS is installed. If it's a file, this is the file, I want to make sure it exists. Desired state configuration takes care of all of that, like, oh, well, hey, you said make sure it already exists, and it does, so I don't need to do anything. Or you said create this file, and it's not there, so I'm going to go ahead and create it for you. So it's just it's a way to declaratively model how you want a system to be configured without having to write all the code for you. The code exists in the DSC resources, which again are similar to PowerShell modules. And you can do all kinds of stuff with it. Install roles. I mean, basically anything you can do with a script. It's just you're not writing the scripts. You're just declaring how this thing should look. And so the Azure VM DSC extension does basically the same thing as the custom script extension, but instead of providing it a PowerShell script, we're providing it a DSC configuration. And I think we'll just look at all that stuff in a demo. Now, that said, it is a little more complicated but there's some cool things about it. So let's start by looking at this. Let's start by looking at a desired state configuration. And I'm just going to burn through it pretty quickly. So import DSC resource, module X web administration. So I want to use this resource, and I don't have it on this system. I'm actually going to RDP into another system here in a second to complete this demo. So Windows feature, IaaS, ensure present, the web server feature. So again, like, it looks kind of daunting if you haven't done it before, but think about it. Like, in literally 4 lines of code, and I wouldn't even really call it code, I've now got what I need to install IaaS. And if it's already there, it won't install. So it takes care of a lot of that behind-the-scenes stuff for me. The other thing that DSC does, and not necessarily with the VM DSC extension, but we'll look at it, I'll mention it when we talk about Azure Automation. But one of the benefits of desired state configuration is you can also set up something called a DSC pull server and have your computers evaluate themselves against the DSC configuration on a schedule to make sure that they stay in the desired state. That's not necessarily related to kind of deployment and what we're talking about here, but just to kind of round out the benefits of desired state configuration is that, like, hey, this is the state I want you in. If you're not in this state, get in this state, and then stay in this state. And if you drift from this state, let desired state configuration put you back. So just another feature, so ensure present web management console. Here we can see depends on, so this feature depends on this one, so make sure that we're doing one before the other. So very simple. All I'm doing with this is installing IaaS. That said, my laptop is kind of goofy. I'm going to remote into another system real quick to finish this demo. There we go. All right, sorry for that delay. All right, so on this system, I've gone ahead and put that DSC configuration at the root of C, so that simple little file that configures IaaS. This is the same file we just looked at. Noticed on this system that I don't have the squiggly lines under my web administration DSC resource. I basically installed that. You can install these just with find module, the name of the module, and then pipe that to install module. And this is important. We're going to come back around to this, and you'll see why this is important. But basically, bottom line is if we look in program files, Windows PowerShell, modules, there it is. My X web administration module exists on this system. Just hold on to that. We'll come back to it. And now I have this PowerShell script to prepare my environment and deploy the DSC extension. So let me authenticate with Azure. A bunch of variables here. I won't dig into those until needed. All right, so the first thing I'm going to run is this command, publish Azure RM VM DSC configuration. So this is pretty cool. Let me run it and I'll show you what happens here. So unlike PowerShell, where I'm just providing it a script, with desired state configuration, I've got these resources that I may want to provide. I may want to provide additional folders. I may want to like bundle my app itself, like my actual HTML files, up with this resource so that when it executes on that VM, everything that DSC needs is self-contained. And that's what this publish Azure RM VM DSC configuration command does. In fact, let me open up Visual Studio real quick, and you'll see why that is opening. Let's look at the command a little bit more. So publish Azure RM VM DSC configuration, resource group, configuration path. So this is the file, the DSC configuration, storage account, container name. So I actually provided Azure storage information to that command. And if I come in here, and this is the storage account and container name that I gave it. We'll see that I now have a zip file up here. I'm just going to go ahead and save this to my desktop, and we'll look at the contents of it. This zip file was created out of this command. So this command has nothing to do with starting the extension on the VM, configuring the VM. This is just about preparing the DSC extension. And if we, what did I do? If we look in that zip file, what we'll find is my configuration, some metadata, and then that X web administration DSC resource. So that command not only like prepares the script to be run against the machine, but it's going to go and find all the dependencies or the dependent resources that are referenced in that script and bundle them up as well. And in this case, I put them in Azure Storage. You could put it up in GitHub or whatnot. So pretty cool. I mean, it prepares everything for you. So now we don't have to worry about downloading these resources. We don't have to deal with making sure that all the dependencies are on the VM for execution. All right, so now that it's prepared, let's go ahead and kick that bad boy off. And I'm just going to go ahead and run this and then explain what's going on. So set Azure RM VM DSC extension, resource group name, where the VM is, the name of the VM, the storage information, where the DSC configuration can be found, which configuration I want to run, and a couple other things. I won't go into too much of the details. This is more about understanding what options that we have. So just like we saw before, if I come back into the portal, I'll go ahead, and I ran this against the exact same VM. If I look at extensions, cool. Now we've got another one, and you can't, I can see Microsoft.PowerShell.DSC. So the extension's been attached to the VM. The VM agent is doing the same type of stuff. It's reaching out to that blob storage, grabbing that zip file, pulling it down onto the VM, expanding it, and doing its thing. This time we actually will look into some of the log files because it's pretty cool what's going on. All right, so back on my VM that we're configuring, if I go into packages, plugins, so we've got a new folder in here, Microsoft.PowerShell.DSC, DSC work. All right, cool. So Windows-DSC-IIS, so that looks very similar to the name of the file. Cool, and there is my actual configuration. Same thing we've been looking at. So we actually bundled that up, uploaded the storage, and now it's on the VM. I mean, there was no smoke and mirrors here. And then as far as troubleshooting, Windows Azure, logs, plugins, Microsoft.PowerShell.DSC, and we got a bunch of stuff in here. I think it is, so if you've ever run a DSC configuration with verbose output, it's pretty verbose. It walks you through each step and whether it was successful or not. And what we're seeing right here, this is a log file on the VM that pretty much mimics the output as if I was to actually manually run this and kind of watch it. So we can actually see that, provisioning's succeeded. So we can see our successes here. And again, if you've got long DSC configurations, your template's going to actually deploy. And we can associate these with a template just like this custom script extension. And if your template will deploy successfully, but you come into the VM, and it's like, man, something's not configured correctly. You can dig into the log, go through, and see kind of which configuration failed. So what we've looked at so far is PowerShell module. Pretty simple stuff. We've looked at the custom script extension. Again, big value there is running PowerShell scripts against a VM without having to, worry about connectivity, downloading scripts and running them. Big benefit there is that we can integrate that with templates and configure, full configurations. We've looked at DSC configuration, very similar to custom script extension. The big difference being instead of writing scripts, we're modeling the state of the computer in a DSC configuration. The final thing I want to look at is Azure Automation. And this is where we go way, way, way beyond just VMs. Azure Automation is a huge, huge subject. I mean, we can do 2 or 3 sessions on just Azure Automation. I'm going to try to cram a bunch of the coolness into just about 15 minutes. So does anybody use like System Center Orchestrator? So Azure Automation comes from the same team at Microsoft. It's kind of the evolution of System Center Orchestrator. And what Azure Automation is just an automation engine for automating basically anything against anything. So Azure Automation is not specific to just Azure resources. What that means is we can run automation from Azure Automation in our data centers. I could run a script against my laptop if I wanted to. But what Azure Automation is just an automation tool that lives in Azure. So we can store PowerShell scripts. There's actually a graphical authoring capabilities in Azure Automation similar to Orchestrator where you drag and drop stuff and chain them together. And honestly, I think we'll just, so the automation language, when Azure Automation was initially released, the automation language was just something called PowerShell Workflow. I'm not going to get into exactly what PowerShell Workflow is because the feedback was, well, PowerShell Workflow is cool, we see the benefit there, but we want to just run PowerShell scripts as well. So they added the ability to run PowerShell scripts as well as graphical authoring capabilities. Something we'll look at is the notion of an asset. Earlier on, I talked about I was going to show you a way to safely store credentials in Azure that can be used in scripts. So we've got this thing called an asset store, which we'll look at. And one of the ways I'm going to use it today is I'm actually going to embed my credentials in Azure, reference those in my scripts, and not have to type them out, not have to store them in code. So it's pretty slick. I'm going to skip this PowerShell workflow slide and just really get into my demos. So the first thing we're going to do is, before I even get into demos, let's just look at it. Like, okay, you just said a lot of stuff, but what are you talking about? So Azure Automation is just another resource that we can add in Azure. So if you want an Azure Automation account, it's just simple as like new. I'm not going to walk through it, but just search for Azure Automation. You go through a little wizard. It's going to ask you a couple questions, and then bam, you've got it set up. Whereas I used to support System Center Orchestrator. I'd go on site, and we'd spend a whole day installing servers and getting everything configured, installing SQL. I mean, this is literally, we could deploy 32 Azure Automation accounts in the next 15 minutes. That said, I already have one deployed. And then so looking here, this is kind of the home pane of Azure Automation. You can see we've got a couple things here. I'm going to skip the ones that I'm not really concerned about. So runbooks. Just like System Center Orchestrator, a piece of automation in Azure Automation is called a runbook. Assets. So this is what I talked about earlier. We can store things like variables. Like if there's a connection string that I want to use against a bunch of runbooks, I can store that in an asset, reference that asset from all my runbooks. And then if that connection string changes, I don't have to go search through 32 runbooks and change it. I just change the asset, and it trickles down and reflects through all of those. Hybrid runbook workers. So what these are is I can set up my Azure Automation account in Azure, but let's say I want to run my scripts or my automation locally in my data center. I can connect a computer to Azure Automation, and when I trigger my runbooks, run them in my data center. So again, this is not an Azure-specific thing. DSC configurations, I'm not going to talk about this, just do not have time. But we can set up what's called a pull server in Azure Automation and really host running complex DSC configurations against on-prem and Azure VMs through Azure Automation. I'm going to dig into a runbook, and I'm just going to create a runbook real quick. Add a new runbook. Create a new runbook, and I'll just give it a name of stop VM. Runbook type, ooh, doesn't like that. Oh, I probably have one from testing this stuff last night. So you can see runbook types. We've got PowerShell, graphical, PowerShell workflow, and graphical PowerShell workflow. I'm just going to go with PowerShell. And you can actually author your PowerShell directly in your browser. Oh, I don't want to do that. However, what I'm going to do is I've written a little script that just stops a VM in the ISC. There is a PowerShell ISC add-on that connects to Azure Automation, so you can do your authoring in the ISC and then just check in your runbooks and publish them directly from the ISC. I don't have that configured. So it's like, cool, I'm just storing PowerShell in Azure, but like, what's the big deal? There's a lot of cool things. What I think is a big deal is what I talked about earlier, safely storing credentials in my asset store. So I have an asset created right now called, I forgot what it's called, but it has my username and password for Azure. They're secured in Azure. I also have this like kind of thing where I can browse stuff. I'm going to browse through my assets, browse through my list of credentials, and there it is right there. Those are my Azure credentials. I can right-click and click Add to Canvas. And now you can see I've got cred equals get automation PS credentials, and then the name of the asset. So I'm basically loading up a PS credential object of my Azure credentials, logging into Azure. Here's the name of the VM, and then I'm stopping that VM. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this, and that just means like check it in. There's also a test pane right here that I could have just clicked on test and tested my script. Now it doesn't test the script, it actually runs the script, but it runs it and it displays the output stream so that like in troubleshooting purposes, like, hey, I know this is failing, but I need to get the output. So that will do it for you. Something else that's cool here is this schedule button. So I have the ability to now attach schedules to these runbooks. So maybe I want to stop all my VMs at 8 p.m. and start them all back up at 8 a.m. So I could create runbooks to do the stop job and the start job and attach schedules to them. Talking with the Azure Automation team, a large amount of runbooks that are currently running in Azure Automation run via a schedule. So it's a very, very popular feature. Also got this other thing here called a webhook. Very, very cool. I'm going to show it off in my next demo. But let me go ahead and start this runbook. Now, when I run this, I have the ability to run it in Azure or run it on a hybrid runbook worker. Like I said before, a hybrid runbook worker is my own computer. In this case, I am going to run this on a hybrid runbook worker. It's just a VM I have in Azure. Let me go ahead and click OK, and I'll talk about why. One of the things Azure Automation provides is isolation. So when you run these scripts in Azure, they are isolated. You know, it's your own environment. They're isolated from other people's stuff. There is a little tiny bit of a, in my opinion, I don't have the facts here, but there's a little tiny bit of a perf hit to achieve that isolation when running these runbooks in Azure. When running on a hybrid runbook worker, they just seem to run a little bit quicker. That said, running on a hybrid runbook worker, it's up to me to maintain that infrastructure. Whereas running in Azure, I have nothing to do with it. I'm only running on a hybrid runbook worker just because we have so little time. And I did some testing, and I found I could squeeze a couple extra seconds out of it. So I started the job. I came to my runbook, and I clicked on this Jobs tab. What this Jobs tab is it just shows me a list of jobs, old jobs, new jobs, running jobs. So just a moment ago, this said queued, and now it's running. So if I come out here to resource groups, and it was this VM right here, and we can see that it's deallocating. So it is actually powering off, so via that runbook. That's a very, very simple demo. I didn't spend any time building parameters into it and whatnot. But you can see the possibilities there. Storing PowerShell in Azure, securely storing credentials, hybrid runbook workers, schedules, and then webhooks. I didn't talk about webhooks, so let's go ahead and do that. And this is where my demonstration deviates entirely from IaaS, or Azure Virtual Machines. And I'm not necessarily advocating, well, let's walk into the demo and I'll talk about what we're going to do. So I have a virtual machine here that is running a website. And in fact, side note, while we're here is, if I look at this virtual machine and look at extensions, we've got a DSC extension. I actually deployed this VM from a template this morning, and I haven't done anything to it yet, so we'll hope everything works well. But I had a template that included DSC to install IaaS, install a website, kind of fully configure my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this IP address and browse to this VM. I don't secure anything in my GitHub account, so pretty much you just look me up on GitHub, and there's a bunch of stuff in there, but all the demos that we've seen are in there somewhere. So I've got this VM running just a simple little demo application. Again, I deployed this morning. I haven't touched it. This was deployed through a template using the DSC extension. But what I want to do is, so we've got the nice Seattle skyline there, but we're not in Seattle. So I want to, well, let me set the stage. What we're going to do is we're going to use Azure Automation to kind of demo some continuous integration. I'm going to make a change to this website, to the code, kind of the code, push it up to GitHub, and through a series of events, Azure Automation is going to detect that a change has been made and make some updates to the website running on the VM. So Azure Automation is going to update everything for me. All I'm going to do is push a commit to GitHub. I'm going to do it, and then I'll talk about how this is working. So if I come in here, I have got, what I want to do is just update the picture, because we're not in Seattle, we're in Auckland. So I'm going to take this picture. You know what? Actually, I need to grab my code. All right, so here is my code in GitHub. So I'm going to clone this to my desktop. All right, so we're done there. All right, so if we look at this picture with the number 5 on it, we've got the Seattle skyline. I'm going to go ahead and replace this with the Auckland skyline. Over here I've got the, yep, I do want to replace it. I'm going to open PowerShell back up. And what is it? Azure Automation CI demo. I'm going to commit my changes. And if you've not worked with GitHub, I'm basically just saying, hey, I've made a change and I'm pushing it back up to GitHub. And git push. And that's all I'm going to do. Now, we're going to click around and look at a bunch of stuff, but as far as changes to anything, that's all I'm doing. So now let's go back into GitHub. Let's just refresh everything. Come on. If I look at my commits, yep, there's a commit change 37 seconds ago. Now, in Azure Automation, I have got a runbook staged. Called Continuous Integration Demo. If I click on this runbook and click on Jobs, notice that I have a job running. How did that happen? We did not do anything. All I did was commit to GitHub. This is where this webhook piece comes in. So what a webhook is I can, on any runbook, we can create very easily. I mean, I'm not going to walk through it, but you literally just say create webhook, and it gives you the URL. The URL is basically a REST endpoint that, when engaged with a post method, starts the runbook. So what actually happened here is that when I committed my code to GitHub, actually in GitHub, they also have webhooks. So I have a webhook set up that states, hey, I'm not actually going to log in or anything, but I have a webhook in GitHub that states, hey, when anything is committed to this repository, trigger this action. Well, that action I have configured in GitHub triggers the webhook in Azure Automation. The Azure Automation runbook fires up and says, all right, hey, cool, somebody started me. I'm going to reach out to GitHub, grab the new contents, and then update this VM. Now, I don't necessarily think, I mean, there's most likely better systems to handle continuous integration stuff like this, but I use this as an example to kind of show off the webhook pieces, some of the flexibility, two systems talking to each other. So when you really start kind of digging into some of the functionality that Azure Automation provides to you, you can come up with some very creative solutions, particularly, like I said, when integrating multiple different systems together. So let's just see where we're at here. I'm just going to grab that address and just open up an incognito window. And bam. So my application was updated without me doing anything about it. Cool, so it's 1:58, or I'm sorry, it's 1:58 in Houston, Texas. That is the end of my session. I've got a couple minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful. Please fill out a survey if you've enjoyed it. And I've got a couple minutes so I can take questions up here. If you want to walk up to the stage, we can also walk out into the hall if it goes long. But thanks a lot for coming.